That's your book there, right, Mark?
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is no stranger to this forum or to this community. He probably needs no introduction, but let's enjoy the pleasure of reviewing some of his qualifications anyway. Dr. Carl Eckberg is Professor Emeritus of History at Illinois State University. He is also the leading scholar on the colonial period of St. Genevieve history. His numerous books in this field include the foundational Colonial St. Genevieve, published in 1985. This was followed by French Roots in the Illinois Country, Francois Vallée, Louis Bolduc, Stealing Indian Women, and A French Aristocrat in the American West. Most recently, St. Louis Rising, co-authored with Sharon Pearson, greatly enhances our understanding of the early development of our upriver neighboring metropolis. Among his many awards, Carl has been honored by the nation of France in 2006 with the same award that was given to Dr. Thompson, but which I cannot pronounce. It's a very high award. Also, in 2014 by the French ambassador to the United States. He is no stranger to this conference or to the foundation, beginning as early as 1980 at the fall meeting of the foundation, where he and Dr. Mel Thurman spoke on the roots of St. Genevieve. Today, we will hear about black slavery and black freedom in colonial St. Genevieve. Please welcome Dr. Carl Eckberg.
Well, thank you very much for that most generous introduction, John. John and I go back a long way here to dinners and parties at Bernie Schramm's house. So, thank you very much. This is some fake news from the New York Times, and I started digging into slavery in St. Genevieve 40 years ago. And then I revisited the issue of slavery 20 years ago. And now on this occasion of 1619, I'm sure you've, the 400th anniversary, you've probably seen it all over the internet and all over the newspapers. And it's a really tricky, and I'm a little hesitant to comment on it because it's such a controversial subject. Here's my understanding of this. Is that traditionally captives of war were enslaved. For example, when Caesar conquered Gaul, conquered France, those Celts, the Gaulois, who were not slaughtered, were enslaved. So it was traditional in the classical world to enslave prisoners of war. So there seemed to be some sort of a justification for enslaving fellow human beings. Prisoners of war is one justification. Another justification was the religious justification, and traditionally for hundreds of years in the Mediterranean world, Christians enslaved Muslims and Muslims enslaved Christians. And so there, once again, we have a justification for enslavement. And so my understanding in this case, and someone might want to correct me on this, is that, as it turned out, these particular Africans who arrived early in 1619 had been baptized as Christians. And they were not prisoners of war, and therefore it was decided to put them under indentures. That is to say, they were not really slaves, they were indentured servants, and that they were eventually freed. So the talk about them as slaves the terminology here is kind of important. Another way of approaching this is that, to the best of my knowledge, it was never said of these Africans that we are enslaving them because they are black Africans, that there was never any racial justification for enslaving these people. Now, eventually, of course, when you get to the antebellum South in the United States, you do get explicit, with John C. Calhoun, for example, you do get explicit racial justifications for enslavement. But at this early period, race didn't seem to be part of the mix. And I would argue that that is largely true also in colonial St. Genevieve. You just don't get any discussion of race as a justification for slavery in the colonial period anywhere in the Illinois country. Aristotle famously said that narratives have to have a beginning and a middle and an end, and I'm sorry that my presentation does not have an end. It does have a beginning and a middle, so you'll have to bear with me that it doesn't have the classical structure of a sound narrative. So here's North America by a French cartographer, famous map. I think Will actually used portions of this too. And so here, of course, we have to remember now that we're in the Illinois country, right? And St. Genevieve, when it was founded, becomes part of the Illinois country. And you have settlements down here along the Gulf Coast very early on. But there's no evidence, I hope I'm right on this, Sharon, there's no evidence that there were any Africans in the Illinois country before the founding of New Orleans in 1718. I think that's true, huh? And in any case, for sure, after the founding of New Orleans in 1718, New Orleans becomes the entrepot for the coming of slaves to the Illinois country. And to the best of my knowledge, it's been said that they came from the French islands like Haiti, like Saint-Domingue, but apparently that's not true, that the slaves who were coming into New Orleans, who eventually wound up in the Illinois country, were actually coming directly from Africa, not via any of the French islands in the Caribbean. And so there is a dramatic transformation of the Illinois country. Of course, we're talking about pre-St. Genevieve, right? We're talking about the 1720s. In 1715, I would suggest, in 1715 we have Cahokia and Kaskaskia. I would suggest in 1715, though both Kaskaskia and Cahokia had some Indian slaves, that there were no Africans in either Kaskaskia or Cahokia in 1715. By 1726, there are a very large number. And so there is a transformation in the style of life and the nature of these French communities in the Illinois country, with a very dramatic increase in the African population in the decade between 1715 and 1726, which kind of transforms the place. And there is the Code Noir, of course, 1724. The Code Noir had existed before for the French islands. That is to say, this is an edict from the French king, Louis the 14th in this case. No, Louis the 15th in this case, had just become king. In any case, this was a fairly lengthy, of 50 segments, 50 different parts to this code. Among other things, it requires that they be baptized as Roman Catholics. Among other things, it requires that all Jews should be chased out of Louisiana because they were unwanted in Louisiana. Among other things, it says that prepubescent children may not be sold separately from their parents. It says also that slaves could obtain freedom, and we're eventually going to talk about that. It was perhaps with some difficulty, but there was that possibility of them becoming free. There isn't any talk about inferior and superior races. Race wasn't the subject here. Slavery was based not on that at this point that I can see. So here is the composition of the Illinois country about the time that St. Genevieve came into existence, 1752. and I just want to make the point that 1/3 of the population was African in the Illinois country. And so this is an issue we got to deal with, folks. I mean, 1/3 of the population is African. Well, it's a subject we must cope with. At this time, of course, St. Genevieve was a minuscule place, having just been founded very recently. And as I remember, there were 2 slaves in St. Genevieve at that time. So it's very, very small. Huh? But in the Illinois country at large, 1/3 Africans. Serious issue, major issue. Then there is, by 1766, a huge leap in the number of slaves. I don't know, can you see down at the bottom? There you have the commandant is Roche Blav, and you have 228 slaves by this time. A large part of them are with the coming of Francois Vallée. So here is Francois Vallée on the 1766 Spanish census. And with his coming to St. Genevieve, what did he get here, Bob?
Which one? Vallée?
Yeah, the old man. Or he wasn't so old then.
He became captain of the militia about 1760, I think.
Right. You know, it's an interesting thing about St. Genevieve. This particular time period, when the original Francois Vallée moves from Kaskaskia to St. Genevieve, happens to be an era when the French and Indian War was ending, and the administration in the Illinois country was kind of disintegrating, and so we don't have very many records. For example, we have much more voluminous documentation for the 1720s than we do for the 1750s. And so we don't know exactly when Francois Vallée came to St. Genevieve from Kaskaskia. But from this, we can say this much, that his coming to St. Genevieve with a very large number of slaves transforms St. Genevieve and turns St. Genevieve into what the rest of the Illinois country, a community with about 1/3 Africans, which continued then throughout the colonial era. So in a certain sense, what the founding of New Orleans did for the Illinois country transformed it in the sense of the Africans living there. Francois Vallée's move from Kaskaskia to St. Genevieve transformed St. Genevieve's. So there are these 2 transformations that relate to the coming of Africans to respective areas, the Illinois country, and to St. Genevieve. I'm willing to, is this getting too complicated? We could do questions right now, as far as I'm concerned. I wouldn't object to that. So by 1779, we have, once again, you can see that the population of Africans, and a very large number of them. By the way, I might say that Francois Vallée Sr. we're talking about, who arrived in St. Genevieve, we think, Bob, about 1760, owned more slaves than anyone else ever would in the area. So he was a really, really major figure on this subject we're talking about. This is the first census. This is the famous copy. This is in the archives at the Missouri History Museum in St. Louis. It is a copy that was done in Havana of a Spanish document. And this is, if you look in the left-hand column, this is the very first census in the region that categorizes people by color, whites, blacks, and tans. Tans being mulattoes. And it registers them here. And so in this census, we can see that in St. Genevieve, there's 1, 4, that's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tans in St. Genevieve. So this is the first census to do things by color exclusively, not by race, but by color. And it is the first one to show free people of color in St. Genevieve. So, I mean, some of these people of color were obviously obtaining their freedom one way or another. This document, which I ran into relatively recently in Spanish archives, a whole book could emanate from this single document. It was signed by de la Souce de Louzière, the founder of New Bourbon. And the reason he signed it is that he had persuaded his friend, Carondelet, the governor of Louisiana, to make him, de la Souce de Louzière, a civil and military commandant of New Bourbon. I mean, New Bourbon may not have warranted that, and they never had their own file for their records, but he was commandant, and so this gives him certain powers. And what he is doing in this document is he is creating a passport for two black guys who want to take two pirogues, two canots. Surely these were pirogues rather than canoes, because canoe can go either way on that issue. It can be a birch bark canoe or it can be a dugout, but in this area, very, very, very few bark canoes were ever used. The canoes are overwhelmingly dugout canoes. In any case, they want to take two dugouts full of apples down to New Orleans to market them. And I am now becoming kind of vaguely aware, if you look carefully through the Spanish archives, that there was a very substantial trade in apples from St. Genevieve and environs, including New Bourbon, down to New Orleans. And the reason for that is that there were a lot of French people living in New Orleans, as we know, and French people tend to love apples. And apples do not grow at all well down in the New Orleans area, and so they were shipping them down from St. Genevieve and environs. Okay, so here are two black guys who are free. He calls them negre, but I think that at least in one case he's actually a tan rather than a black. But he calls them free blacks, negre libre. And the reason he's doing this is that this is their passport to go up and down the Mississippi River without being interfered with. That is to say, no one can say, oh, these guys must be slaves, we're going to apprehend them and return them to their owners. This is their document that they are in fact free persons. It's in a sense a passport. And that that de la Souce de Louzière has the right to do this because he is commandant at Nouvelle Bourbon, at New Bourbon. Now, Francois Vallée, too, the son, could have done this in St. Genevieve. He could have done one of these passports, too. So it could have gone either way. It could have been but there had to be a commandant to do this, and in this case, it was, one of these guys was from New Bourbon, he says, huh? Yeah, he says one's from St. Genevieve, and one's from New Bourbon, and they're taking apples down. Okay, so I'm trying to track one of these guys, Jasmine. One's named Neptune and one's Jasmine. I haven't checked on Neptune yet, but I've been looking at Jasmine. Huh? One of these colored guys going downriver. Huh? So who is he? Right, the map showing St. Genevieve here. Here's old St. Genevieve down here, and new St. Genevieve here, and where am I here? And New Bourbon here, and the Saline down here, just to give you some orientation géographique. So here is our first, that I know of, our first record that includes the name Jasmine. It's at 1762. It's the baptism of Marie Françoise over in Kaskaskia. The baptismal record is signed by Aubert, a Jesuit priest. And at this time, he says Aubert, Jesuit. Huh? He identifies himself as a Jesuit because this is 1 year before the Jesuit order was suppressed in the Illinois country, which was, in my opinion, a catastrophe for the area, but the Jesuits were suppressed. So a year later, he wouldn't have been able to sign as a Jesuit, but the Jesuits were still up and running in 1762. Okay, so he is baptizing he is baptizing this a female child, and she is born of the legitimate marriage of Jasmine and Catherine. So, you know, there had been a marriage, can't find any marriage record, but these two slaves had been married, so the child is a legitimate child, and these slaves belong to Dufresne. Some of you may know Dufresne. It was Michel Dufresne. He was a militia officer in Kaskaskia, and his daughter, Marie Dufresne, married the first commandant in St. Genevieve, Philippe Rastel de Rocheblave, who was commandant in St. Genevieve from 1766 to 1770, when he gets pushed out and Francois Vallée really takes charge. Dufresne is the owner of these slaves, and then apparently, you know, it's one of these areas in the records where we don't have sufficient documentation. These slaves are obviously sold to Francois Vallée, because here is their second child, Charles Jasmine, and we want to try to sort this all out, but this is 1764, and here it's interesting, the priest is Mervin, who at this time cannot sign as a Jesuit, because he's a famous Jesuit, but he cannot sign as a Jesuit because the Jesuit order had been suppressed. So once again, it's the same parents, the legitimate marriage, but now we have a first name for the father. There was no first name on that first record. His name is Francois Jasmine, and his wife Catherine. And here then, 2 years later, this is the sequence of births in this family. That is to say, the sequence of births with Francois Jasmine and his wife Catherine is every 2 years, just as it was they're obviously not using any kind of birth control. They're having a child pretty regularly every 2 years. So far, so good. Yeah.
It's interesting, the Valley spells, in this document, it's spelled with two E's on the back, and a lot later on it can only be.
Yeah, let's look at those signatories. In this case, you can tell they've moved to St. Genevieve. This isn't Kaskaskia any longer, Bob. So there's Charles Vallée. At this time, let's see, was had Joseph been killed?
1766, I think, or so.
Right. He was killed at lead mines, right? Joseph was?
He's coming back from mine.
Okay, so this is a son of Francois Vallée, Charles, and this is, let's see, this is the Elizabeth Biron. That is the sister of Francois Vallée's. That's right. Yeah. This is Francois' sister-in-law. So this is the crème de la crème, serving as godmother and godfather on this baptism for. So we don't have the record, but sometime between 1762 and 1764, Francois Vallée bought the slave family from Michel Dufresne, who stayed in Kaskaskia. Vallée brought them to. So these slaves are moving from Kaskaskia across the river to St. Genevieve. Then another one, Joseph. Once again, we don't have to go. Mervin. In this case, all these little details are interesting to me and Bob and Sharon. 6 of us or something. But here, Mervin, the former Jesuit, actually makes it explicitly clear that he is no longer a Jesuit. He identifies himself as a prêtre missionnaire. So, he had been, a really important Jesuit, but now he came back. They were all sent down to New Orleans. He comes back and serves as a missionary priest instead of a Jesuit. And so here, once again, we have, let's see, are the parents identified? It's once again, the legitimate marriage of Francois. And the nickname for Catherine, Catin. He doesn't spell out Catherine. So there's Catherine Catin and her husband, Francois Jasmine. This is an absolutely remarkable black couple. And here, I think, is the last. This is Nicholas. This is the famous Gibault. This is a different record up here, but Givaux's signature is down here. Of course, he's not, never was a Jesuit. So here is the, here are, oh, that's right. This was a baptism of 3 slaves, and one of them, am I getting confused here? Oh, this is an incomplete record. This is an incomplete record. The first one was Nicholas. But one of them here is from the, once again, we come back to the legitimate marriage of Francois and Catherine. So this has got to be the Jasmine couple. It's Francois and Jasmine who are the parents here, okay? I mean, let me not try to get any deeper into that one. Huh?
So do you think they had triplets?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. So here is the state inventory of Marianne Biron Vallée, Francois Vallée's wife, from 1782. Once again, I'm trying to identify in that record of de la Souce de Lousière, about the 2 black guys taking canoes with apples down to New Orleans. The one black guy is identified simply as Jasmine. So who the hell is he? You know, which of the Jasmines is he? Okay, and so here, and these are the values over here, and so here is he's identified as a Negro, huh? as a black guy, Francois Jasmine, and his wife, Catherine, and he is identified as being 60 years old in 1782. Okay, 60 years old in 1782. So you can do the arithmetic. In 1797, when de la Souce de Lousière did that passport for the 2 black guys, 1797, that's 15 years later, that would have made him 75 years old. So he ain't taking a canoe load of apples to New Orleans when he's 75 years old, right? Unless he's an extraordinary guy. I mean, really, in some ways, one of the great guys of the era, you know. But I don't think he was thinking of a canoe of apples down at that period of time. And so here is another option for the Jasmine on the passport. And this, I don't have a baptismal record for him though. For some, his name was Riquet, and he was 18 years old in 1782, and so he's a candidate. And then here's, by the way, it says here that he's the son of Francois Jasmine. So this is here's mom and dad up here, and then these 3 boys. So there's Riquet and there's Carlos, who was 16 years old. He's 18 years old. He's 16 years old. And here's Joseph, who was 14 years old. So actually, any one of these guys is a candidate in 1797 for being the guy with the canoe taking the apples down to New Orleans. And so I'm getting close to the end of this. Maybe this. Oh no, it's not quite the end. In 1788, so after the death of Francois Vallée and his wife Marianne Biron, one of their sons, Charles, whose signature is here, inherited, here we have him up there, okay? Francois Jasmine and Catherine, his wife. And in this 1788 document, they are purchasing their freedom for 800 piastres from Charles Vallée. And this is the document of manumission, in which it is said that when they have their liberté, they will have all of the privileges and obligations attached to the status of being free. I love that. What the hell does that mean? Huh? Once they are free, they will have all of the privileges and responsibilities all of their privileges and responsibility attached to the status of being free persons. Huh? I mean, does that give them a right to vote? You know, they weren't holding elections in 1788. But it's a wonderful, to me, it's a wonderful phrase. You know, there's nothing like, of course, these are black people, and so, you know, they don't really count. I mean, this, you know, once they're free, you know, there's no stigma attached to being Africans or blacks. No racial stuff in here at all. Okay, so this is 1788. But we know, okay, so we know that members of the Jasmine family were being freed. But the complicating factor here is on the 1787 census, there are Jasmines who are free, mulattoes. But we don't have any document like this to see how they became free. And so this is an extraordinary document of manumission which pertains to other members of the family as well as Francois. It's relevant, I should say, to other members of the family because we know that other members of the family were also free. And it was some other member of the family who was taking the pirogue, the canoe of apples down to New Orleans. Did I get that straightened out? Pretty much? Yeah? Right. Okay, so we're back to this. And as I said, I have a beginning for this presentation. I have a middle, but I don't have any end. I would like to say I've wrapped this up and found out who this was, and I think that this family could be followed into the American era. But for me, as I've said before, the world comes to an end in 1804, and this is 1797, and so we're close to the end of the world. Huh? And so I would be happy to take any questions or comments that there may be out there, huh? Because I don't have any end. It's fini, it's the end. I'm done. Peter.
Something a little later was Margaret Brown's excavation at the edge of the Catholic Church cemetery in Prairie du Rocher, and she found manacles for slaves. And this would have been, you know, 18.
Slavery was here. We can't deny it. Huh? There's physical evidence. There's documentary evidence. It's a subject. It's a subject that we can't just ignore, for sure. Yeah, please.
Were the slaves, were they generally used for agriculture and mines?
My feeling is overwhelmingly for agriculture.
Okay.
Some at the mines. That seems to. Moses Austin brought some slaves to the mines. I think in the French period, very limited use in the mines. I think overwhelmingly agriculture. And I get the sense that Indian slaves were more likely to be used for domestic help around the house than they were even out in the agricultural fields. It's very, very, very difficult to figure this out. You know, there's a famous passage in Will talked about Henry Brackenridge, who was in St. Genevieve in the 1790s, and he has a wonderful description. It's a curious description because he talks about the habitants, the farmers, if you will, and their slaves of leaving town to go out to their fields in the big field. And what's curious about it is it's so democratic. It's like the habitants and the slaves are all kind of mixed together, and they've got their equipment, and they're leaving town to go out to the big field and do their agriculture. But in any case, he's talking about black slaves there, and I think they're mostly agricultural laborers. And I think that goes all the way back to the 1720s.
That was.
Yeah. I'm sorry?
That was a 6 month. That was a seasonal job.
A seasonal thing. Yeah, that's true. Yes, please.
There's some black craftsmen though who like helped build the cabins. I mean, I've come across where it sounds like there were blacks who were carpenters or whatever, at least trained in some of the trades.
Yeah. Right. We know very, very little about that. There are some records. I think Jim maybe knows more about this than I do. I think there are building contracts. There's a building contract for a house in which one guy says he's going to furnish some black workers who are going to work on the house. Right. Oh, and also it's true that when de la Souce de Louzière built his house, I think it was Jean-Baptiste Vallée lent him some slaves to work on that house. There's a famous passage in one of the letters of de la Souce de Louzière from the 1790s in which he says these valet slaves are impossible, you know. They do whatever they want. They carry their own firearms. You know, you don't mess with them because they're valet slaves. I mean, there's a certain aristocracy within the slave community. You don't mess with the valet slaves, you know.
Well, they also say that, you know, John Smith T, who was a
competitor of Moses, yeah.
in Boston, but he had 2 slaves that were famous gunsmiths. I mean,
Right.
And he had all kinds of guns.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have more documentation on that for sure, yeah. So, yes, sir.
This is an amazing series of documents to be able to piece together in this kind of detail, the history of this family, and
Right.
It's enviable. So that's one point. The other thing is, I'm wondering. I assume that these blacks were freed under the Spanish law of self-purchase. Is that right?
I think we've got to say that.
Yeah.
Because of the time, of
Does it not say that? Does it not, is there a price given?
Yeah, there is. It was 800 piastres, 4,000 livres for the couple.
Yeah.
And so sometime during their lives as slaves, Francois Jasmine and his wife Catherine had accumulated a hell of a pile of money.
Yeah.
Because, you know, 800 piastres, that's a big chunk of money in 1788.
Of course, under Spanish law, they were allowed to take Sundays off, for instance, for their own account, work for their own account.
Right.
So I assume that was going on up here?
Coartación, is it coartación?
Well, that's the right of self-purchase. You know,
Right, yeah, right.
But under the Spanish slave code,
Right.
they were supposed to have their own, as you know, a piece of land.
In the document, there's no mention that this is under Spanish law or something, right?
No, but
Right.
I mean,
It's implied.
evidence of any
Yeah.
even informal custom of self-purchase under the French.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I think there was. I don't think that I've seen it.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Well, an individual slave owner could always allow that. I just
Sure,
wondered whether
sure,
there was.
yeah.
Under the Spanish law, you know, the slave had the right to buy himself.
Right,
And
right.
the
Doesn't-
master had to accept the price
right.
that an appraiser set.
Right.
If they couldn't agree, that there had to be an appraiser brought into court, and the appraiser
Right.
set the price, and the master had to accept it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
The
That was
difference
Spanish
between the
law?
Code Noir
Yeah.
and the Spanish code is that.
Different, yeah.
But how much different? Are they significantly different?
It's astonishing.
Yeah, sure.
I was gonna say, in St. Louis, there was a situation where, a father paid the price for his, daughter to be freed, and so I'm wondering if the children were freed, before the parents, perhaps they contributed, towards the thought.
Yeah, it's really hard to sort out. I thought for a while that maybe in the manumission of the parents, the kids were included in 1788, but yet there's at least one free Jasmine in the 1787 census, unless the 1788 document is only formalizing a situation that had pre-existed. Huh? Hard to get it figured out. Yes.
Looking at this document again, what's fascinating is it's not only that you have 2 freed slaves who are being given a responsibility, but they're in charge of this transport of the
Right.
apples because the canoes are being
They're engagés.
driven by two or three other engagés.
Right, exactly. They're the commandants.
Yeah, so they've been given,
Of
not
the-
only are they free, but they have responsibility.
Right, they're in charge of the little convoy of apples going down to New Orleans, huh? And they'd get down there in about 3 weeks. Regularly by this time, it's 3 weeks in a pirogue from St. Genevieve to New Orleans. If these guys knew what they were doing, and we assume they knew very well what they were doing, right? Yeah, please, John.
Carl, we've talked about this before, but one of the things that is sometimes raised as an ameliorating factor in the customs of slavery in this area is that it was based on a Code Noir, or subsequently the Code Negro, whatever the Spanish version was.
Right.
But weren't those codes also enforced in Lower Louisiana?
You have to talk to the judge about that.
Well, I'm very interested in his opinion, but my understanding is that Lower Louisiana also was under Code Noir or Code, and the worst thing that you could say to a slave in Upper Louisiana was, if you keep that up, I'll sell you down the river.
Right.
And down the river meant going to a sugarcane plantation or some kind of plantation that was much harsher. But that was also under Code Noir. And by the way, if it was colorblind, why was it Code Noir instead of, some other code?
I think that the expression being sold down the river, that phrase has got to be a 19th century phrase.
Yeah. Well, but whatever. There was a harsher version in a different style of agriculture.
Right. Okay, let's come back to the first issue that I was trying to discuss about when you have slaves and you have some feeling that this has got to be justified. You could use the religious thing as the Christians and Muslims did. You could use the prisoners of war justification. And I'm thinking about Francois Vallée, the original Francois Vallée here. In the 1750s and 60s, he's enormously increasing his ownership of black slaves. But for the life of me, I don't think he's thinking. He surely isn't saying it. I don't think he's thinking, well, these Africans are inferior. It's no problem having them as slaves. I just don't think that he was thinking in racial terms. These guys are not talking about race at all. They're not,
Except the name of the code.
Right. I mean, for this French officer that Sharon and I are studying from the 1720s, he has an Indian wife, a full, a real Indian wife, and that couple, a French officer and his Indian wife, own both black and Indian slaves. And so, are they saying, these slaves, they're inferior creatures, therefore they're our slaves? Once again, I don't want to dwell on this very much, but we are so used to associating slavery with racism that it's hard for us to shake that out of our heads. But I think to understand Colonial St. Genevieve, you do have to kind of shake it out of your head. Yes, please.
Do you think it's more than of a caste system or a classist system?
Yeah. I don't know. They were for sale, I'm thinking of the Dutch who were big slave traders, and they and brought slaves for example, to Jamestown. If the Dutch had been able to buy President Trump's favorite people, the Norwegians, the Dutch would have gone up to Norway and bought Norwegians, brought them over to Jamestown, dumped them off, and said, give them codfish and rye bread and work them to death. So it was just a commercial thing. Right. Please, yeah.
I'm originally from Northern Ohio and attended this conference, probably about 15 years ago, having to do with the Native Americans in that area, Black Swamp and south of Lake Erie. down to, say, the area now known as Grand Rapids, and it was kind of the mouth of the Maumee River, which empties into Lake Erie. And one of the professors there giving a talk talked about how slavery in the Native American community in the 16 and 1700s,
Yeah.
they within themselves, they were growing corn commercially because they were using it as a product to trade, commerce, and they had both native and white slaves. They lived in cabins. Some of the native tribes in that area and their slaves built their cabins for them, but they were documented as having white slaves. And I think slavery, you know, in general is about power and commerce. And in that sense, you know, at the time it can become about color, but I think there's a basis there for understanding.
Yeah, after the revolt against the reign of King James in England in the 1680s, many of the rebels were sent as white slaves to Jamaica and Barbados. It's a great movie about that, starring Errol Flynn, called Captain Blood, about white slaves in the British Caribbean. So it was an issue of commerce. They were talking about race. Yes, please.
Didn't the Indian tribes made slaves of their prisoners among
Sure,
themselves?
oh, sure, sure.
And so I
Sure
thought
they did.
perhaps they sold, the ones here would sell their slaves to the colonists that were here.
Oh, sure.
And that's how they got
Oh, no,
here.
sure, that's exactly
Yeah,
what happened.
So it was all,
Sure,
yeah, a
indeed.
matter of
Yeah.
buying and.
Intertribal warfare in the West led to slaves coming to the Illinois country villages. No doubt about that. Yeah, for sure that's true.
You know, there's always the thing they write about, believe we know, bringing 500 slaves from the island. And I know you talked about this the first time. You talked also about the growth of the African American population.
It exploded in the 1720s, right?
What
Jerry?
was that? Was that remote slaves or?
No,
I know 500.
no,
I know
no,
you said
no,
500 is no
no,
thing.
nope.
I think he brought 20. I think he had 20. He had a contract to eventually have that many slaves, but that never materialized. I think
Yeah.
there are records of him having slaves in Saint Philippe near Fort de Chartres, and some black slaves working in the mines in the 18th century, but it was a
So you think it
relatively
was, once again,
insignificant number.
migration up the river for farming needs for that growth that you saw in the 17th?
You know, I think it's conceivable that some, traders from Kaskaskia were frequenting Mobile before the founding of New Orleans, say 1715. I think it's conceivable that one of those traders from Kaskaskia could have brought back to the Illinois country an African before the founding of New Orleans. But really, it's with the coming of New Orleans that you get the influx of Africans up the river, for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.